Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to have you here. I'm Stephanie Sandala. I am Programming and Outreach Specialist at Library Link NJ. I'm so excited to have some great cookbook authors here, Abra Berens and Martha Holmberg. Abra Berens is a Michigan chef, author, and former farmer. She is the author of Roughage, A Practical Guide to Vegetables, which is a 2020 Michigan Notable Book winner and James Beard nominee, and Grist, A Practical Guide to Cooking with Grains, Beans, Seeds, and Legumes. Her latest book is Pulp, A Practical Guide to Cooking with Fruit. Also, Roughage and Grist are so good, you guys. Check them out, make sure they're in your backlist. And Pulp is great too. We'll talk about that more later. Martha Holmberg is a food writer who has co-authored 9 or so cookbooks, maybe more, notably 6 Seasons, one of my favorites, A New Way with Vegetables, co-written by Chef Joshua McFadden, who won a James Beard Award a couple of years ago. She's also co-author of Grains for Every Season, also with McFadden, which was a James Beard finalist. Martha lives in Spokane, Washington, and her latest book is Simply Tomato, 100 Recipes for Enjoying Your Favorite Ingredient all year long. I'm so happy to have you both here.
Thank you.
Yes. So to get started, for those watching who may not have a lot of knowledge of your work, can you each talk a little bit about yourself and your cooking experience and maybe anything that inspires you? So Abra, I love your setup. So do you want to go first? Because your background, your whole setup is so amazing where you are right now. So you can talk about that a little bit. That'd be great.
Absolutely. I'm really kind of through and through a Michigander. So I live in Michigan, and my sort of cooking career started in Michigan at Zingerman's Deli in Ann Arbor. So I started cooking there. I went from the front of house to the back of house there. And after cooking under Roger Bowser for a couple of years, I was trying to decide between cooking school and going into the Peace Corps that I had gotten into. And Roger said, well, you do need some formal education, but you don't need a 2.5-year school. So maybe consider going to Ballymaloe, which is a cooking school in the south of Ireland. And I bring that up because that cooking school is based on a 100-acre working organic farm. And I think that time in Ireland really helped me to realize that I wanted to try to carve out a niche in the food world where my primary focus is to connect consumers with producers. And so everything that I've done and I try to do over the course of my career is to try to give people insight into what it takes to grow these ingredients and bring this food to market. And so kind of fast forward a little bit, I started a vegetable farm in 2009. And so a lot of my writing and specifically Roughage came out of that time farming. And I was writing a regular column for our local paper that was taking ingredients that we were growing and then kind of showing different preparation techniques or different flavor combinations, as well as giving some insight into how that crop is grown and what it means to us on the farm. And so that became Roughage, my first book that's all about vegetables and different ways to prepare them. And I liked writing that book so much that I convinced Sarah Billingsley at Chronicle to let me write another one. And she was really, at that time we had closed our farm because I was like moving between Traverse City, Michigan and Chicago, which is like 6 hours away every, 4-6 months. And that's not a like super smart way to set up your life. And so by that point, I had moved back down to Grainer Farm where I am now. And our grain program was really growing. It was about 400 acres of different crops. So there's about 12 different crops that the grain program grows, including edible beans and heirloom corns and things like that. So that became kind of the fodder for the second book, Grist, which really followed the same format. So each chapter is an ingredient and then has different preparation techniques throughout, as well as, a bunch of pantry kind of condiments and things like that to go with it. And Pulp is my newest book. It's all based on fruit. And I think I wanted to write Pulp even before Roughage was finished. Michigan is the second most agriculturally diverse state in the country. And so and a big reason for that is because of how much fruit we grow. And this is very similar to parts of Washington where we really benefit from our proximity to the lake. Lake Michigan is this, giant body of water that goes all down our western side. And what it does is it moderates the temperatures coming, it gets really cold in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And then those cold fronts cross over the lake and they pick up a bunch of moisture and that warms the air. And then when it hits the land mass, it's not quite as cold. And then the same thing happens in the summer where the hot air from the plain states moves over the lake and cools off. So we get really nice breezes and moderated temperatures, which is perfect for growing fruit. And I found that because of how much fruit is around, it kind of turns up in my savory cooking as well. So pulp is sort of my love letter to Michigan fruit and all the different ways to prepare it, either both savory and in sweet recipes too. And I'm at Grainer Farm right now. I'm sitting in our schoolhouse. Grainer started in 2006 to be a farm camp for kid, as well as grow a diverse array of vegetables all season. And I joined the farm here in 2017 to put dinner series into our farm. So every Friday and Saturday night, year round, about 60 people turn up and we give them a guided tour of the farm and walk through. And then we end up in the greenhouse, which is a glass greenhouse that has grow houses on either side. And it's a 7-course tasting menu based exclusively around what we're growing. So the menu changes every weekend, and it just is constantly evolving depending on what we're harvesting.
I really love that. And I love hearing about your inspirations for Pulp, your latest book too. So thank you for that insight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Martha, what about you? Do you want to share more about your background for those who might not know or want to learn more about your work and what you do?
Sure, absolutely. Well, in my fantasy world, I do what Abra does. I just love the idea of cooking from what's right there in your garden. And I love entertaining and making beautiful tables and, being creative with food. But my background really was less in the kitchen and the fields and more on the editorial side. I've been doing this for a long time. So it's like 1,000 years ago, I went to cooking school in Paris at a place called Abra Berens, which was owned by Anne Willan, who was also quite a prominent cookbook author. So I went and I did my cooking studies for a year or so, but I also got to be involved in a lot of publishing. So I learned how to write a recipe. I learned how books go together. I would get pulled out from my classes and sent with Anne on some project in London where she was working on a book. So it was an amazing education, both in French cooking techniques and then also in how the publishing world works. So did that for a few years. And then I landed at a cooking magazine called Fine Cooking back in the early 90s. And I became the editor of that. And that was an incredible education also because our system was we would go to the best chefs and pastry chefs and people who are the expert practitioners, and we would have them write the articles, although we ghost wrote them. Hence, I'm a co-writer. I guess that started then. But basically, you were working with all these amazing, chefs from Chez Panisse and all over the place who were sharing their techniques. So did that for a while. And then decided I really belonged on the West Coast. That was in Connecticut. So love the East Coast from there, but went to Portland, Oregon to be the food editor of the newspaper. So I've kind of done a survey. I've done books, I've done magazines, did newspapers, and that was fantastic. That was right when Portland was just exploding with creativity, and there's such amazing produce there from the Willamette Valley and the Hood River and all kinds of stuff. So it was a fabulous place to be involved with food. And the sort of through line from all of that is two things. It's home cooking and really understanding what home cooks like and the questions they have. You really get an intimate relationship with especially your newspaper readers, but your magazine readers also, when you put out recipes and ideas, and then you get a lot of feedback. So it really was a great education to understand, how people cook and how they integrate it into their lives and how they shop at the grocery store versus the farmer's market and all of that stuff. So that was wonderful. And then a few years after that, I was at the newspaper for about 5 years. And then I just kind of migrated mostly into books and worked on the books with Josh McFadden. He's based in Portland. And then a couple of years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to leave beautiful Portland and head east. So we're all the way in Eastern Washington. We're a half an hour from Idaho, which has its own interesting elements. And we're close to the Canadian border. We're near British Columbia. So it's a really different growing environment. So the farmers markets and everything are a little less rich and abundant at the moment. And the food scene in the restaurants and stuff is kind of like, I call it the balsamic drizzle. It's like, it's a few years before ago, but people are getting excited about food and it's kind of emerging and burgeoning. And we have we bought a property right in the city, but it's got about a third, almost a half of an acre. And we have a lot of gardens and we have some fruit trees and it's so much work. I don't know why we did that, but so I have my own little mini farm. But that's me. I'm mostly books right now.
Oh, Martha, I love that too. And I also agree, like Abra's living the dream right now. So I just when he showed us the schoolhouse earlier, I'm like, this is amazing. So thank you for that visual tour earlier. It was great. So
I think it's funny because like listening to both of you talk, it's like grass is always greener. Because I was like, that sounds so good, So it's really, I think that's just goes to show there's so many parts of the food world to operate in, and there's just, and also just in the education and learning spaces. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm just like such a huge lover of libraries, and just can't get enough. And they're such an important civic institution, and so to get to be a part of them in any small way is really a treat. So thanks for hosting this.
Oh, no, thank you again for being here. So we're so happy to have you. So, and especially for pulp, it has like such a unique story in its creation. And you talk about this very well in the book, but for those who haven't read it yet, can you give us some highlights? Personally, I love the apple salad, which seems really simple, but it is fantastic and so creative. So yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the origin story for it really goes back to some of the dinners that I was hosting at Bare Knuckle Farm up in northern Michigan, and it's continued through to the dinners that we do here at Grainer, which is that we just have so much fruit. And so it didn't really occur to me that it was of note that is included in savory cooking. And I had a dinner guest, Martha was saying, you get a lot of feedback from people, and sometimes that's great. And sometimes it's, you get a lot of feedback. We'll just put it that way. Somebody said at a dinner, you use a lot of fruit in your cooking and it didn't sound good. Turns out I liked it. And I was like, okay, that's sure, we'll just go with that as a positive. And so it was after that comment that I realized, I guess I do cook with fruit a lot. And the way that I tend to incorporate fruit, it's rare apart from baking. And even with baking, fruit is more of it's like less of a star, more of a like chorus or like an ensemble cast member. And so I think what it does is it helps to add color and acidity and sometimes sweetness and texture to different dishes. So that apple salad that you're referencing, there's a couple of different, there's a lot of like quote unquote salads in pulp because I think we need more words than salad for like a big platter of different fruits and vegetables kind of put together in a thoughtful way. But both of them, there's both an apple, like a raw apple salad and also a cooked apple salad. And what I usually end up doing is kind of creating a similar formula where it's something like crunchy, something kind of creamy and rich, something acidic, and that's all kind of tying it together. And so that formula you can really see in some of the savory components, be it, as a salad or as something like, one of my favorite recipes is this baked ricotta, where you kind of stir together some ricotta, some egg, a little bit of salt and pepper, put it into a baking dish and bake it, and then top it with blackberries or raspberries or something, anything that's in the druplet family, which is a new word that I didn't feel confident that I had enough material to write a blackberry chapter, a raspberry chapter, or a mulberry chapter. And thankfully, there's a silly word that ties them all together into druplets. And so you just top it with that and then bake it again, and they kind of burst and lend this like purple and pink color to this appetizer or snacky dinner. And then you can serve that just with a great big salad and a bunch of toast. And, it's not strictly a raspberry recipe, but I think that it is lacking without it. And that's kind of how I feel about fruit in general, is that it's not something that is necessary to your dinner, but I find that I miss it when it's not there. It also kind of started as a little bit of a joke because, the health department or the, Health and Human Services says we should eat 8 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. And roughage kind of came out of the idea that that was drudgery to have to like choke down, 8 portions of vegetables, but that it doesn't really need to be. And I found that nobody really talks about the fruit portion of it. It's just fruit kind of gets glossed over, which I think is indicative to some of the larger questions about it. I was doing kind of research at the outset of this book and said, what to my friends, like, what would you want out of a fruit cookbook? And it was almost exclusively 50-50. 50% of people said, oh, I never buy fruit because I don't know what to do with it and it goes bad really quickly. And then the other half said, why would I buy a fruit cookbook? You just eat it. And so it felt like there was kind of a nice little window there to explore some other ways to work with this series of ingredients.
No, I really appreciate that. So I think you're right. I really do miss it when it's not there. Especially for like, lunches or dinners where you're like, oh, like this is like adding so much and it has like this great flavor. And when it isn't there, I'm really noticing it more now. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah, it's like, can you imagine Thanksgiving without the cranberry sauce? I mean, it's the only thing that has any sort of acidity in the entire plate of brown, generally speaking. And so I think that kind of, that rings true to me in other meals throughout the year too.
Yeah, I agree. And Martha, you wrote a really lovely cookbook about the humble tomato, which in New Jersey, we do love our tomatoes. So what led you to have a love for tomatoes? And you outline this really well in your book as well, but can you give us some highlights of what led to your passion for tomatoes and how you've come to use them in your cooking?
Yes, and of course the Jersey tomatoes, legendary.
Yes.
But there's so many varieties of tomato these days, it's hard to keep up. I don't know what brought me to that, because I didn't grow up like my mom and dad didn't have a garden. We didn't even eat fresh food growing up. She went to the military commissary and brought home the frozen spinach, and that was all just fine back then. But I think that, first of all, they're so seductive. Tomatoes are so seductive just in the way they look and the way they smell. And somehow I started growing them, and they're pretty easy to grow, at least in the situation that I was in. And so you get this amazing reward, you get this pretty little frilly plant. And then, a couple of months later, fruit's happening and you can just pick it right off. And I just got enchanted with all the different varieties and the fact that, it was so delicious. I think that's it. Also, most tomatoes that you buy in the grocery store are really lacking. Although I do have a section in the book where I talk about the types of tomatoes in the store that are kind of okay. And if you can't get a homegrown tomato, they're pretty good. So I just kind of, that became the thing that I obsessed on. I do grow other things for fun, but that's the only thing that I sort of feel like I have a feeling with. And then I'm a real, I like a lot of umami in my food, and umami is that flavor It's not salty, sweet, sour, bitter, but it's that kind of savory flavor. And tomatoes really have a lot of them naturally. It comes from glutamate. So, you know, you might think MSG is not so great, but it's actually the flavor that makes us like that type of food, like aged cheeses and dried mushrooms, and tomatoes have a lot. And when you're eating them fresh, they're balanced with all the fruity, juicy, you know, bright acidic flavors. And when you cook them down, or you're cooking with a canned tomato, that umami really comes to the fore. And I love that.
Oh, I love that too. This makes me want a tomato salad. You have so many good ones in your book. So yes, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And then Abra, your book is also about like growing and like, you know, getting involved, learning more about the growing process, growers and farmers, and your profile, some really great ones. And I like how it's so inclusive as well. So how did you come to learn more about the growing industry overall and get involved in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets back to that initial kind of North Star that I've carved out for myself. So Roughage was so much about my time growing produce, and the lessons that I learned from doing that. You know, like I always use garlic as the example, but you know, I put garlic in most things. I love garlic. I love it in all of its forms. And it didn't occur to me until I was farming that garlic takes 9 months to grow, at least in our area. So you plant the cloves in the middle of October, usually kind of that second week of October, and then you cover it up with straw, let it overwinter, and then in the spring, these green shoots come up, so you can harvest green garlic, or you get the garlic scapes, but you don't ever harvest the cloves or the heads until around here, like, you know, end of June, early July, and then it sits in a barn and cures, so it gets those papery layers for at least a month, and then we brush off all the dirt, trim them up, and sell them, and that's 9 months, you know, which is as long as it takes to grow a baby, you know, and yet I like had no idea or respect for it as I was just chucking it into every soup I could. And so I think each crop kind of has similar sort of like aha moments. And then as I was starting to write Grist, I was like, how are we going to tell these stories? Because I don't know what goes into growing rice. Like I live in Michigan, like we don't grow rice here. And so like one of those days I, you know, went to bed, I've been kind of puzzling it out. And I woke up at 4 a.m. and was like, we can just ask them. Like, you know, a real brainiac over here. I was like, oh, we could just ask the growers and then include those stories in the book. And so that's how it started. And really what I wanted to do with that is, and you're talking about the inclusivity of it, part of it for me is I think that there is a disconnect for a lot of folks on what it means to be a farmer or to be a grower. And that's not really anybody's fault. You know, 100 years ago, 30% of America's population were farmers, and today it's 3%. So I don't think we can fault the other 97% for simply not having access to the people or the knowledge for it. And those who you do have access to are generally farmers of a particular style. They usually sell at farmers markets where you can talk to them or have a roadside stand or some way to interact. And so what I was trying to do was to find more of those stories of people who you might not be able to interact with. And what I found in Grist is that especially with grains and legumes, there's a whole other set of jobs that are very invisible to the average consumer. Someone like Carl Wagner, who cleans all of the seed for Grainer, and he is a 4th generation row crop farmer. And row crops, for those who don't know, are things like corn and soy. You know, they're usually grown at large scale, minimal diversity, you know, things like that. And he was really looking for a way to add sort of his mark and create space for himself on his family's farm. And so he taught himself and learned how to be a seed cleaner. And I didn't know that that job existed until I worked at Grainer. And what it is it's, you know, after all of our, say our wheat is harvested, we take it to Carl, who then passes it through a series of screens to sift out all of the weed seed. You know, there's like always going to be different plants that are in the wheat field. And so things like hairy vetch or clover, whatever, you're getting rid of those seeds. And then also it goes through a series of screens, and it's through a series of what is effectively like an air hockey table. They're called blowers. And what they'll do is they'll blow out any seed that is a different density than the seed that you're after. And so that can be different types of seed, but it can also be seeds that are broken. And so they're not as desirable because they're broken. Or if something like ergot, which I think a lot of us heard about through the Salem witch trials as being, a potential reason for that behavior. That seed is going to be lighter in density because it has a mold in it that has broken down some of the interior of it. And so because it's lighter, you can apply a fan to it and it'll blow as opposed to the denser wheat seed. It's fascinating work. And then also the way that it gets cut. So things that are wheat, after it's like cleaned of its weed seed or undesirables, then they take what's called series of cuts. And so if that seed were going to become seed for another farmer to plant their field, that's one set of cuts. If it's going to be distilled, because it's going through the distilling process, it doesn't have to be as particularly organized as, something that's going into animal feed, which has to have, minimal amounts of that sort of like, mold or diseases or things like that, because the animals are going to process it. But then human consumption is the finest and most specific grading for it. And so I think that one of the things that has, I ask every person I interview, like, what do you want a non-grower or a non-producer to know about your work? And so many people said, we just want people to know that we're smart, that we're doing this work creatively. It's very hard work and not just physically taxing, but also mentally. Each season is different and you have to pivot and make these changes. And also that we're here, and I think it was Carl who said that we just want people to know that we're out here doing this work because, there's such a narrative about rural America and the hollowing out of rural America, and that, that's not inaccurate, but there are also thriving communities, and that this work is really important. It happened at the same time I was writing Grist, at the same time as the start of the pandemic, and noticing that I think Cronuts and the mermaid cake had just had its Instagram viral time. And all of a sudden on a dime, it felt like nobody was talking about Cronuts. Nobody was talking about mermaid cake. Everybody was trying to find flour and beans. And I think that really speaks to how much we want these. And I found Grains for Every Season to be such a critical book, to really further that idea that these are, quote unquote, humble ingredients, but they're really the mainstays of lots of different diets and what we go to when we need stability. And so that, combined with the social justice protests after the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it made sense to recognize that these ingredients also have long and not very beautiful legacies, and that we can talk about that. With pulp, it's also about that. It's a little bit more about the market and the labor practices that go into fruit, and so whereas with Grist, it sort of dawned on me at one point that the only ingredient that was included that was indigenous to North America is wild rice. And everything else was brought here. And, so kind of telling those stories. In pulp, it dawned on me at the end of writing it that the only ingredient that is an annual, which is that you plant it each year, are the ground cherries. Everything else is a perennial. And that shapes our understanding of where these markets are, that it takes 10 years to go from planting a vine to harvesting grapes and having a bottle of wine. It's 7 years to plant a cherry tree and have a harvest from it. That is mimicked over and over and over again in the book. And I think really speaks to kind of the ways that farmers are different. They're all farmers, but all of their farms are different, and all of their balance sheets and business models and markets are very different. I don't remember what your question was. I've just been talking for 10 minutes, but that's, kind of the background behind where the interviews came from.
No, that was such a thoughtful answer. And I really do like how you bring into focus people who we don't really think about, and jobs that I didn't really know existed beforehand. So I really like that aspect of it.
I mean, you must feel that way at the library. I feel like there's so much work that goes into a library functioning that is not just the person at the desk or all of that. So I think every industry has those things. And the more we know about them, the more empathetic we can all be to each other's places in life.
Yes, definitely. And I do see a question. We'll have some time at the end for Q&A as well, just a heads
Great.
up. So, but Martha, I wanted to ask you a question too. And Abra, this might be a good question for you as well. So you both have really creative and inspiring recipes. So what is your process for developing a recipe? Or like, how long does it take? I know it's different for each recipe, but do you just have to go back and retest and keep going? Or do you have a special formula for creating recipes? I'd love to hear about that process from both of you. So Martha, do you want to go first?
I will go first. Well, of course, you start with the appetite. You think, what do I want to eat? What would be good? But especially in looking back at tomato and looking at a lot of recipes I've developed, I think I kind of come from a real classic French Western cooking sort of repertoire. And I start with a lot of things that are combinations that I've liked, that I know people like, that are just kind of in there. And then I say, how can I make that better? So for example, I was looking at the salads and tomato, and I have a riff on the niçoise salad. And I have like 20 ideas for making a caprese salad a little bit different. And I took a BLT sandwich and I turned it into a salad. And I have something I call a Greek salad, like upgrade or some dumb silly name, whatever. But because I do love a lot of classic combinations, from the sort of heritage and discipline that I learned cooking in. And yet, you can always make them better. You can always change them up. You can always freshen them up. So that's kind of a framework that I use for a lot of things. How I do it, I think I'm a fast recipe developer and a fast tester. I talk to people, I don't know, Abra, what you do, but I talk to my friends who are like, oh, and I'm on the 10th test and I'm working this out and I'm testing, and then I have like 15 civilian testers, and I'm just like, that's way too much work. Like, generally, I know what I want. I'm so steeped in techniques. That's the other thing that I really try to impart in my books is, if you understand the underlying architecture of a dish and you understand what happens when you do this to this ingredient, when you put the onions on low heat or you put the onions on high heat, different things happen. So I'm so comfortable in working with that kind of basic techniques that I kind of know how the dish is going to come together. And there are definitely times when it's not good. I'll make it and then I'll make it again. And I'm like, you know what, I'm not going to pursue this because it's not well enough conceived to come together. But there are a lot of, and don't tell anybody, but there are a lot of times that I publish a book where it's like, I think I tested that one, but they always end up working well because I've done this for so long. And also what I do with my recipes is I really try to put myself in the home cook, first of all, at the grocery store. There they are, trying to figure out what ingredients, so how do they make a choice? How much should I get? What do I do if there's not this? And then, in the kitchen, not everybody has all the same equipment or their stove, or there's just so many variables in the way people cook. It's such a dynamic situation that I try to anticipate as much of that and so that you can make your own decisions as you're facing these little moments of mine doesn't look the way it does in the picture, or is this right, etc. So really writing with almost like channeling the person who's cooking as opposed to the way I would cook, if that makes sense.
Which I think has always been the thing I've been most inspired by your work. I mean,
Thanks.
I think it's made them not just chef books, because most restaurant books for a home cook are pretty much garbage, because it's like, you have to, like, there was one, I saw a recipe a long time ago that was like for poached shrimp or something. And you had to have like, 2 gallons of olive oil. And it's like, nobody in their home kitchen has 2 gallons of olive oil. That is a restaurant recipe. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because like, you're totally right. It's like home cooks are dealing with a number of different hurdles that restaurants tend to sidestep. The first one being that we are cooking for, 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day, and so our situations are different. And the amount of time, like the number of times I've written a recipe and been like, oh, I don't know, poaching fennel should take like, I don't know, like what, 20 minutes? And it's like, no, when I do it at home, it's 45 minutes, but it's either that it took 45 minutes, but I was doing a bunch of other stuff while I was at work, or our ovens are bigger and hotter and our burners are hotter and bigger, all that stuff. And so it's interesting. And that's a real challenge, I think. And I think you do that so well. Yeah, I don't know. It's like just a fascinating difference between that.
Thank you. Well, I obviously love cooking, and I think when people can cook something successfully, it just is one of the most wonderful human experiences, because first of all, you're feeding yourself or your family, but it's a creative act, and you've made something and you can feel proud about it, and it connects you to agriculture. It's just being able to cook at home and have success is a really important thing. And so I do spend a lot of time trying to help people have success. And I don't really like the phrase empowerment, just because everybody uses it for all kinds of things, but really, it frustrates me when I see people reading a recipe and they're like, a tablespoon of parsley. I don't have a tablespoon of parsley. I guess I can't do the recipe. Or, I want people to lose that attitude and really feel like they get it. They understand what they're trying to achieve in the recipe, and it gives them the confidence to move forward and to improvise a little bit. Everybody needs to improvise based on what you have on hand and what you're in the mood for and what your family likes and all that. So.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Cameo, the walk on.
Yeah, I'm always appreciative of cameos, pets, significant others, partners. It's all great. So yeah, Martha, specifically, I know you're cooking a lot with tomatoes in this book. Do you have a preferred way to cook tomatoes by the end of it, or just eating them raw? I was just curious from my own personal interest as well.
Well, I think celebrating a fresh tomato where you don't apply a lot of heat is wonderful. And as you know, there's a big salad section and ideas of ways to even just dress up a platter of sliced tomatoes, which, for the first harvest from your own tomatoes, you're probably just going to have maybe a little bit of salt, maybe a little olive oil, and just eat them like that. But after a while, you want to dress it up a little bit. So when it's a fresh in-season tomato, I don't cook it that much, but what I do love is a canned tomato. A lot of the book is spent kind of extolling the virtues of a canned tomato, which is not a poor imitation of a fresh tomato. It's really its own separate thing, and it can do wonderful things. And as I said before with the umami, as you're transforming a can of whole peeled tomatoes, it's kind of watery, whatever. As you're cooking it down, it just transforms into something completely different with a whole different sort of very lush texture and very intense, sweet, tart, tangy, meaty flavor. So I think for the long cook type of things, I'd like to use a canned. And then for the, when you have a perfect fresh tomato, I'll do raw things with it. But, with pairing with cheeses and crumbs and herbs and nuts and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I like mixing it up as well. So I think that's a good idea. Yeah. And Abra, what about you? I know throughout the book, you're like trying all these different fruits and everything. So by the end of the book, do you have a favorite fruit that you came to enjoy the most, or did any fruit stand out?
I mean, I'm grateful that I still feel a connection to the fruit when it shows up. We're going to get rhubarb for the first time on Saturday. So I feel like at some point next week, I'm going to make the rye spätzle with the pork chop and poached rhubarb and spinach salad. And then it just feels like we're sort of off to the races, but I do really love apricots. And I love how they're sort of this like I feel like we have like Stockholm syndrome with apricots in Michigan because they like don't, we don't get them every year. They always bloom early and then get battered by frost. But when we do have them, they're so good. And so like, I think that makes them in some ways my favorite. I also feel that way about plums. We generally have a more consistent plum crop than we do apricots here, but they're just that perfect balance of they come on at a time when everyone's getting ready to start cooking again, that we've kind of moved, like, it's a little cooler out at night. You want to turn the stove back on. They have that like bracing acidity, beautiful color. They kind of hit all the marks for me. So I really do love plums. And there's a rum plum clafouti in the book, and that the first 100 pages or so of pulp is it's called my baker's toolkit. I'm not someone who derives a ton of pleasure from like long baking projects. Like I have a friend, my best friend, Tim Mazurek, will spend the entire weekend making, some sort of like falutin dessert and loves it. I am not that way. And I have found over the years a collection of recipes that were either ones that I had developed or came from pastry chefs I got to work near, that are really kind of a beautiful canvas for fruit. And the clafouti recipe is from my friend's and somebody whose profile, Gene Garthy. It's his wife's clafouti recipe, and they are cherry growers in northern Michigan. And so they most often make cherry clafouti, which is very traditional and nice because it comes together quickly in the summer. But I love it with so many different fruits, and the plums. At one point I had like 6 different varieties of plums, and so put those in the base and then poured this like eggy custard over it, and it bakes up beautifully brown and chewy but a little crackly on the top. And we make it all winter with cranberries. I've made it with raspberries and tart blueberries and all of those things too. But yeah, that's probably one of my favorite go-tos, especially because I usually have everything on hand, and we can make it. I've made it with oat milk for those who are avoiding dairy, or with oat flour for those who are avoiding gluten. And it comes out a little bit differently, but for the most part, it's still very tasty. And so it meets all the marks for me of versatile, quick, and I usually don't have to go to the store. So those are kind of my three benchmarks.
Well, just as a little side note to that, I have a cherry tomato clafouti recipe in the tomato book. So that same idea of taking something classic and just putting a little bit of riff on it. It has herbs and a little bit of Parmesan to make it savory rather than the sweet, but that's a fun.
That sounds delicious.
Yeah.
No, I like the idea of using classic ingredients you already have on hand too. So it's so helpful. Yeah. This is a question for both of you. So does anyone ever ask you if you get tired of cooking? And do you ever think that you could?
I definitely get tired of cooking. I feel like every 6 weeks I go through a phase where I just want to get takeout like 4 days in a row. And I used to feel really embarrassed about that. And now it's sort of like, it's just part of the like cycle, of doing stuff. And I think it's, Martha was saying like the ability to feel empowered by knowledge and things like that. I also want people to feel like they have a free pass. If they don't enjoy cooking, you don't have to do it. It's one of the nice things about our society is that like, takeout exists, the freezer section exists. And so, you can really save it for times that you do want to do it. It's also usually means that there's a lot of other things going on in life if I don't want to cook. And I do feel grateful that I can cook all day at work and then go home and still want to make dinner. But I think that it's just like, it ebbs and flows for me.
I love to cook as much as I can. People do ask sometimes, they'll be like, do you cook every day? And then like, well, if you don't, how do you feed yourself? But I guess you go to Trader Joe's. I don't know. We don't have very good takeout in my city. So, but I do get tired of cooking from recipes. When I have a lot of projects going on, I'm either developing my own recipes and trying to be disciplined about it, or I do a lot of recipe testing for other books. And so you're recipe testing and you're paying attention to that. And it's so hard because my natural style is very much intuitive and improvisational. And you get into kind of that flow mode, where you're cooking and you're making things happen, and it's all, it's all one big enjoyable process. So I do get tired of cooking from recipes, but I don't get tired of being in the kitchen. The dishes are another question. Boy, you develop a lot of dirty dishes when you're recipe testing a cookbook.
True.
Yeah, dishes are the one thing that I like the least about cooking. So I will admit that. So.
And there is the problem in Abra. I don't know if you have this because you have other people around in your organization who could probably eat the food, but when you're recipe testing and there's just two of you at home, I put as much as I can in the freezer, but there's a lot of times where it's like, well, it's good, but where's it going? I don't really have neighbors who would swap it, share the food that way. And so it's a dilemma. You have a lot of food that goes to waste that shouldn't, but it does at the moment.
Yeah, so much of the recipe testing for us happens at, kind of throughout the writing process. And so we can absorb it, one recipe for the dinner for that night or whatever. But I found that with the photo shoots, because all three of the books were shot at my house and it's just so much food. And so we found that, end up boxing it up. So I would, whenever I was going the ingredient shopping for the photo shoots, I would end up ordering a sleeve of high quality takeout containers so that people could reheat in it, and then just boxing it up and bringing it to work or bringing it around. And we're lucky our neighbor across the street manages some musicians, and each book at one point somebody was at their place on a stop through for tour. And if you ever need to move a lot of food, musicians that have on the road for a month is the best. I could have made dog food and they would have been this is the best food I've ever had. It's just they're so hungry for that home cooked meal, kind of thing. And so that was a really nice, surprising outlet. For it.
That's that's definitely excellent.
That is, yes, thank you. And I do want to actually move to Q&A because I know we're coming up on time, but Ekshada had a great question, which I think could be actually for both of you. Which do you think is the best vegetable or fruit to grow for a beginner kitchen gardener?
I would say the thing I encourage people to start growing if they're interested first are fresh herbs. I think that they are the most bang for buck in terms of how they can change your food. And they don't take up a ton of space, and it's kind of low capital to get started with it. You don't have to build a whole bunch of raised beds. You can just get a couple of pots or whatever. And I think they're a really nice way to get started. I think that for me in our home garden, because we have sort of 10 garden beds in our yard, and I would say 2 of them are dedicated to herbs, and 2 are perennial herbs and 1 is annual herbs. And then we always do grow a couple boxes of tomatoes, and I have to make myself hold back. I grow 1 striped German, those great big juicy different colored multicolored ones, which always take forever to ripen and are disappointing when they split and things like that. But I like to grow those, and then I grow a lot of cherry tomatoes. And I feel like I like growing cherry tomatoes because you can put them in so many things, but also because my favorite way to preserve them is once we get, kind of past the glut where we can really eat them in a day, is I just roast them down with olive oil and salt and till they burst, and that liquid reduces, and then pack them into freezer containers and freeze them for the winter time. So those are kind of my 2 favorites.
Well, I'm going to respond with the same 2. I think growing fresh herbs is not hard to do. You need some sunshine, but you don't need a lot of space. And in addition to being able to liven up your meals, you're saving about $1 million a year, because when you buy herbs at the grocery store and they're tortured and pressed in those little plastic packs, and they're not very fragrant, and they cost $2.79. It's ridiculous. So this way you can just use as little or as many as you want just fresh basil, dill, parsley, all of that. But then tomatoes, obviously, you knew that was going to be my answer. But I would say specifically a sun gold tomato plant. They are a variety of cherry tomato. It's not a yellow, it's a like tangerine orange color. And they are the sweetest, fruitiest, like it's tomato flavored, but beyond. It's just, Abra's nodding her head. She loves them too, I bet. They're really wonderful. And I find the plants are very forgiving, easy to grow. They are an indeterminate, so you can they can get a little rangy, but you can either put them on a trellis or you can trim off the suckers and just have one vine. But they, and again, because they're cherry tomatoes, they don't need a whole lot of ripening time. So you don't have that heartbreak of trying to grow the big beefsteak. And I was, going back to the question before about what's your favorite way to cook a tomato, I forgot all about roasting until Abra mentioned that. That's something I do a lot with fresh tomatoes, especially when we have too many. And I have like 3 or 4 different roasting methods in the book. But with a cherry tomato, just like Abra said, just slam them in a baking sheet, 450 oven, olive oil, salt and pepper, and they burst and they kind of make their own little sauce right there that you can either keep in the fridge for a week or put in the freezer or whatever. But a cherry tomato. Green beans also is something quite satisfying, I think. Just a good old blue lake green bean, or even a yellow, what we used to call a wax bean. There are all kinds of varieties. They grow really well in my home gardens for some reason, and they're just really delicious and satisfying, much nicer than the kind of leathery things that you get in the grocery store.
Yeah, that's true.
Great. That was a great question. Now, there's also a librarian question asking if you could both talk about your research process. As a librarian, we're always curious about research. So was there any background information that you both used for your books and any good resources that you found along the way? So Abra, what about you? Because I know you've done a lot of research for pulp specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think the most research went into grist, because I felt like I was learning about the legacy of these grains and legumes sort of as I was writing the book. And so I think I end up going back to other cookbooks, and I try to find cookbooks that are, of different times and different eras and different locations to sort of cross-reference. And then I use Google a lot to research stuff. And then it's just about getting it typed up and then verifying it to be sure. Because I think it's easy for sort of misinformation to spread like wildfire. I realized recently that I had always been told that Chicago's name comes from the indigenous word for ramp. It's apparently not true. And it's amazing. Every spring you see that same thing pop up, so trying to find other sources to verify it has been really important. And that oftentimes means going to the people who deal with it. The entire wheat introduction essay in Grist is about just how frustrating the different nomenclature and words and understandings of wheat, because it's a very old crop. And so as we all, age, I think we're all in the same boat. We get more and more layers, and, there's more opportunity for misunderstanding. So trying to kind of peel that back and get at the heart of it.
I actually am so wary of what Abra just mentioned, which is misinformation that gets published and then it gets picked up and picked up and picked up, that I don't have any of that kind of information. The books that I've been working on really focus on what's happening in the kitchen. And if I do have a little bit of background or history, I really try to go to the most authoritative source I can find. But this happened also when I was on the magazine and the newspaper. Freelancers will give you some great anecdote or some little history about that. And it's like, do you know that from any firsthand experience? Did you do primary source research, or did you just get it from some other article? And it's such a skill, obviously, and it's such a serious endeavor to do proper research that, and I'm not trained in that. And I just kind of try to focus on the things that I feel fully confident in. On the grains book, the one that I wrote with Josh McFadden, we did we did have a lot of background about what the grains are and what their nutritional value is, et cetera. And that came from the Whole Grains Council, I believe, which was a good website that had a lot of basic information. And then you kind of cross-reference with other institutions. I have gone to a couple of what they call the Grain Gathering, which is Washington State University's grain extension program up in the sort of right in the Skagit Valley of Washington. And that's a really dynamic association that is trying to help people get off a commodity grain growing train and to grow varieties that millers can mill well and bakers can do good things with, and to revive ancient grains and just kind of getting away from the commodity thing. So I did learn a bit from that and brought that knowledge to working on that book. But it's really important, as Abra said, to not just perpetuate myths and kind of sloppy research. So, and I'm not very intellectual, so I stick to the kitchen and the things that I know.
I appreciate that honesty too. And I guess my last question for both of you is, what do you hope readers take away from your latest book? Anything you want it to inspire people to do or to learn more about?
I think that you can do more with fruit than just eat it out of hand. That's the whole thing.
Completely agree, which I've learned from trying the recipes. So yes, I love that. Martha, what about you?
I think for this book, it's to really seek out a good tomato, to just don't bother with the ones that are just insipid, pale. We got a burger at a restaurant the other day and just this slice of whatever, don't bother with that. Get them at a farmer's market, grow your own, or find the ones in the grocery stores that have been bred to have some flavor and acidity and brightness, because it's a wonderful, joyful thing and it'll make you want more. But if you're just, picking up a plum tomato from the supermarket, it's going to be disappointing. And like Abra said before, people are like, I don't eat fruit because it's not very good. And that can happen with tomatoes. So seek out something that's ripe and in season.
Yes, I appreciate that advice. And thank you, Abra and Martha, for being here. This was such a fun and great conversation. I felt so inspired, just learning more about your process and your books. And I'm going to try more recipes now, even more than I did before. So this is fantastic. So thank you both again.
Thank you so much for hosting us and for all you attendees. And thank you for listening. And it was really fun to meet Abra. We know each other's work, but we've never met, quote unquote, in person until today. So.
Agreed. It's like the beauty of libraries threefold here. So thanks for hosting it. And Martha, thanks for taking time and attending. It's really a dream come true.
Thank you both.
All right. Bye, everybody.